The year was 1320, and behind the stone walls of a remote convent near Milan, something was happening that would shake the very foundations of medieval Christianity. The sisters were supposed to be asleep, lost in prayer or peaceful slumber. Instead, the corridors echoed with whispered conversations and careful footsteps. When a patrol sister pushed open a wooden door to investigate the unusual sounds, what she discovered would send shockwaves through the ecclesiastical hierarchy and reveal truths about convent life that the church had desperately tried to hide. For centuries, we've been told a sanitized version of medieval religious life. The popular imagination paints convents as serene sanctuaries where devoted women spent their days in quiet contemplation, their nights in peaceful rest, their lives dedicated entirely to spiritual pursuits. Hollywood films and romantic literature have given us images of noble sacrifice, pure devotion, and heavenly calling. But the reality documented in dusty archives across Europe tells a dramatically different story. Today, we're going to explore 5 of the most shocking practices that actually took place behind convent walls during the medieval period. These aren't sensationalized tales or anti-religious propaganda. These are documented facts, recorded by bishops, investigators, and the church's own officials. They reveal a world where human nature collided violently with impossible expectations, where desperation bred innovation, and where the most sacred spaces became theaters for the most forbidden behaviors. What we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval religious life. From secret underground tunnels connecting male and female quarters, to elaborate deceptions involving carved wooden objects. From midnight visitors who weren't supposed to exist, to emotional bonds so intense they terrified church authorities. These practices weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic responses to a system that demanded superhuman perfection from ordinary human beings. The first shocking practice we need to examine involves something the medieval church called nocturnales societatis, or night companies. This innocent-sounding Latin phrase concealed one of the most persistent scandals in convent history. Official documents from England, France, and Flanders reveal a pattern that repeated across centuries and continents. After the evening prayers concluded and the doors were supposedly locked for the night, men were entering spaces that were meant to be entirely female domains. These weren't random intruders or violent invasions. The visitors were priests, monks, and other clerics who arrived through carefully planned routes. They brought wine, engaged in what they claimed were theological discussions, and stayed far longer than any spiritual consultation would require. The evidence comes from surprise inspections conducted by bishops and papal envoys, who discovered warm beds in guest chambers, wine goblets still damp from recent use, and hidden windows connecting visiting halls to the sisters' dormitories. One of the most extensively documented cases occurred at the Priory of St. Mary in Winchester during the 13th century. Inspectors found not only evidence of these nocturnal visits, but architectural modifications that had been made to facilitate them. Small windows had been cut through walls, creating discrete connections between supposedly separate areas. The prior, when confronted with the evidence, insisted that the monks had come only for spiritual guidance, yet the physical evidence told a different story entirely. In Paris, archbishops' reports describe even more elaborate arrangements. 22 nuns were suspected of maintaining improper relationships with visiting clerics. Hidden passages were discovered beneath the foundations of buildings, narrow tunnels that connected male and female quarters. These weren't ancient construction features or natural formations. They were deliberately built modifications, created at the request of someone inside the convent itself. The church's response reveals how widespread this practice had become. By the end of the 15th century, papal envoys were issuing warnings that any man found inside a convent after nightfall would face excommunication. This was not a threat made lightly. Excommunication could end a cleric's entire career and social standing. The fact that such severe penalties were necessary suggests that softer measures had repeatedly failed to address the problem. What makes these nocturnal visits particularly shocking is the power dynamic involved. The women in these convents weren't there by choice. Many were daughters sent by families who couldn't afford dowries or didn't want to support unmarried women. Others were widows, refugees, or girls as young as 12 or 13 who had no say in their fate. They lived in complete isolation from the outside world, dependent on religious authorities for every aspect of their lives. When priests and monks began appearing in their quarters after dark, these women faced an impossible situation. Refusing the attention of a cleric could be interpreted as rebellion against divine authority. The medieval worldview positioned priests as direct intermediaries between God and ordinary people. Their words carried enormous psychological weight, especially for women who had been taught since childhood that obedience was their highest virtue. The documents reveal another disturbing element. Some sisters welcomed these visits not out of desire, but out of fear of complete emotional isolation. Life in the cloister was marked by the absolute absence of affectionate bonds. A kind gesture, an extended conversation, or simple human attention could become precious beyond measure for women who had been cut off from all family connections and friendships. Contemporary letters describe a form of silent complicity that developed within many convents. Some sisters looked the other way when they heard footsteps in corridors where no footsteps should be. Others actively helped conceal evidence of these visits. Phrases appear in documents like, "We let them be," and "We did not want to destroy their spirit." These fragments suggest that many nuns understood instinctively that spiritual life alone could not sustain women who had been torn from the world with no alternative options. The architectural evidence is perhaps most telling. The hidden windows, secret passages, and modified chambers weren't built by outsiders. They required inside knowledge, careful planning, and ongoing maintenance. Someone within these supposedly sacred spaces was actively facilitating these encounters. The modifications suggest a level of organization and premeditation that contradicts any notion of spontaneous spiritual consultation. Financial records add another layer to the story. Payments appear for unusual construction work, for materials that don't match any official building projects, and for craftsmen who specialized in what documents delicately call adjustments to existing structures. These expenses were carefully hidden within larger budgets, disguised as routine maintenance or approved renovations. The geographic spread of these practices is equally revealing. Similar patterns appear in records from Germany, Italy, Spain, and even remote regions of Scotland and Ireland. This wasn't a local phenomenon or a temporary corruption. It was a systematic response to structural problems within the monastic system itself. When we examine the ages of the women involved, another shocking pattern emerges. Many of the documented cases involve novices, young women who had recently entered religious life. They were the most vulnerable, the least experienced, and the most dependent on guidance from their supposed spiritual mentors. The power imbalance was so complete that resistance would have required not just courage, but a level of understanding about manipulation that most young women of the period simply didn't possess. The Church's official response was always the same: deny, minimize, and relocate the problem. When evidence became undeniable, authorities blamed the women involved rather than examining the system that made such exploitation possible. The men who violated their vows and abused their positions were quietly transferred to other locations. The women faced public shame, severe penances, or expulsion from the only home they had known. This pattern of nocturnal visits represents more than isolated moral failures. It reveals a fundamental contradiction at the heart of medieval religious life. The same institution that demanded absolute purity was creating conditions that made corruption almost inevitable. By isolating vulnerable women and giving unrestricted access to men in positions of authority, the Church created perfect conditions for abuse while simultaneously denying that such abuse was possible. The documentation of these practices comes from the Church's own records, preserved because medieval bureaucracy demanded detailed accounts of everything. Even scandals were carefully catalogued, though the language used was often coded or euphemistic. Reading between the lines of these official reports reveals a world where the sacred and the forbidden existed side by side, where walls built to protect became tools for concealment, and where the most trusted guardians became the greatest threats. As we prepare to examine the second shocking practice that flourished in medieval convents, we must remember that these weren't isolated incidents or exaggerated tales. They were documented realities that shaped the lives of thousands of women across centuries of European history. The next practice we'll explore involves something even more disturbing, something that reveals how desperation and isolation could drive human beings to create solutions that defied both nature and religious law. The second shocking practice that medieval church officials desperately tried to hide involved what they delicately termed in their Latin documents as instrumenta lignea, or wooden implements. The discovery of these objects in convent cells across Europe between 1300 and 1500 created such scandal that many records were deliberately destroyed, leaving only fragments of testimony scattered across different archives. What survived tells a story of human ingenuity born from crushing isolation and impossible demands for lifelong celibacy. The most detailed account comes from a convent near Cologne in 1387, where a routine inspection by Dominican officials uncovered carved wooden objects hidden beneath loose floorboards in the sisters' quarters. The investigators' report, written in Latin so dense it obscures as much as it reveals, describes finding items that had been crafted with remarkable skill and attention to anatomical detail. These weren't crude approximations, but sophisticated replicas that required considerable woodworking expertise to create. What makes this discovery particularly shocking is the evidence suggesting these objects were being produced within the convent itself. The same inspection revealed wood shavings, carving tools, and partially completed items in the workshop where sisters supposedly spent their time creating religious artifacts and practical items for daily use. Someone had been using the convent's own resources during hours meant for prayer and contemplation to craft implements that served decidedly non-spiritual purposes. The investigation revealed that this wasn't the work of a single disturbed individual. At least 7 sisters were involved in what appeared to be an organized system of production and distribution. They had developed techniques for concealing their work, creating false bottoms in storage chests and hollowing out sections of their prayer books to hide smaller items. The level of coordination required suggests months or even years of careful planning. Church records from other regions reveal similar discoveries. In Bavaria, officials found wooden objects alongside detailed drawings that appeared to serve as construction guides. In northern France, investigators discovered that sisters had been trading these items with other convents, creating a network that extended across hundreds of miles. Letters written in coded Latin refer to devotional aids for private prayer and instruments of spiritual comfort, euphemisms that barely concealed their true nature. The psychological context makes these discoveries even more disturbing. Many of the women involved had been forced into religious life as children or teenagers. They had taken vows of perpetual chastity without fully understanding what that commitment would mean for their adult lives. As they matured, the natural development of sexual desire collided violently with religious expectations that such feelings should simply not exist. Medieval medical understanding provided no framework for addressing these conflicts. Church doctrine insisted that truly faithful women would experience no carnal desires whatsoever. When sisters found themselves struggling with physical needs, they had no legitimate outlet for discussion or guidance. The official response to any mention of such struggles was increased prayer, harsh penance, and often public humiliation designed to shame women back into supposed purity. Contemporary accounts from confessors reveal the impossible psychological burden these expectations created. sisters would weep during confession, describing feelings of spiritual failure because they experienced natural human desires. Some believed they were possessed by demons. Others convinced themselves they were fundamentally evil because they couldn't achieve the emotional numbness that religious life seemed to demand. The wooden implements represented a desperate attempt to reconcile irreconcilable demands. They allowed women to address physical needs without involving another person, technically preserving their vows of celibacy while providing some relief from desires that celibate life had failed to eliminate. The sophistication of these objects suggests that their creation wasn't driven by simple lust, but by carefully reasoned attempts to find solutions within an impossible system. The Church's response when these discoveries came to light was swift and brutal. The sisters involved faced years of public penance, forced fasting, and isolation that was severe even by medieval standards. They were made to confess their sins before the entire community, describing in humiliating detail exactly what they had done and why. The objects themselves were ceremonially burned, though not before being carefully catalogued in records that church officials claimed were necessary for preventing future occurrences. What's particularly revealing is how these punishments were designed not just to punish the guilty, but to terrorize other women who might be tempted towards similar solutions. The public nature of the penalties sent a clear message that the Church preferred women to suffer in silence rather than find any form of relief that wasn't officially sanctioned. The message was reinforced through sermons that described the discovered objects as evidence of demonic influence and spiritual corruption. Yet the practice continued to spread. Archives from the 15th century contain references to similar discoveries in convents across England, Spain, and even remote regions of Eastern Europe. Each new scandal led to increasingly harsh penalties and more elaborate systems of surveillance. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Women continued to enter religious life without genuine vocations, continued to struggle with natural human needs, and continued to seek solutions when official channels provided nothing but condemnation. The third shocking practice that flourished behind convent walls involved something that medieval authorities found even more threatening than secret implements or nocturnal visits. This was the development of intense emotional and physical relationships between women themselves. Church officials called these bonds particular friendships and considered them among the most dangerous threats to monastic discipline. The evidence for these relationships comes from love letters written in Latin and hidden within religious manuscripts, from poems discovered in the margins of prayer books, and from testimony given during ecclesiastical investigations. The language used is often coded, mixing religious metaphor with unmistakably personal emotion. Sisters addressed each other as light of my darkness, my heart's true companion, and the mirror of my soul. These weren't casual friendships, but passionate attachments that defied every rule about emotional detachment. One of the most extensively documented cases involves two sisters at a Benedictine convent in Germany during the 1440s. Their correspondence, discovered during a surprise inspection, reveals a relationship that had developed over several years from initial attraction through deepening intimacy to what can only be described as a form of spiritual and physical marriage. They had created private rituals, exchanged handmade rings, and developed their own secret language for communicating during the enforced silences of religious life. The intensity of these relationships often exceeded anything the women had experienced in the outside world. The enforced isolation of convent life created a hothouse environment where any emotional connection became magnified beyond normal proportions. Women who had been denied all other forms of human intimacy poured their entire emotional capacity into relationships with fellow sisters who shared their circumstances and understood their struggles. Church investigators were particularly disturbed by evidence that these relationships included physical intimacy. Medical examinations, conducted by church-appointed physicians, sometimes revealed what officials delicately termed evidence of unnatural practices. The language used in these reports is deliberately obscure, but the implications are clear enough. Women were finding ways to express physical affection and sexual desire within relationships that church doctrine insisted should remain purely spiritual. What made these relationships especially threatening to religious authorities was their potential to create alternative power structures within convents. When two women formed an exclusive bond, they might support each other in resistance to harsh rules, or provide comfort that reduced their dependence on official religious consolation. They created private worlds that existed parallel to the official religious community, complete with their own rituals, communications, and sources of meaning. The geographic spread of documented cases suggests this was a widespread phenomenon rather than isolated incidents. Similar evidence appears in records from France, England, Italy, and the Low Countries. The consistency of the patterns suggests that these relationships were a natural response to the emotional vacuum created by monastic life, rather than random occurrences or cultural anomalies specific to particular regions. Church officials developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and preventing these relationships. Sisters were forbidden from spending time alone together, from sharing cells, or from engaging in conversations that weren't witnessed by others. Physical contact of any kind became suspect. Even innocent gestures of affection, like embracing during prayer or holding hands during walks, were classified as potential signs of dangerous attachment. The penalties for discovered relationships were severe and designed to break the bonds as completely as possible. The women involved were typically separated, often transferred to different convents hundreds of miles apart. They faced extended periods of solitary confinement, harsh physical penances, and public humiliation designed to shame them back into compliance. Letters between separated lovers reveal the devastating psychological impact of these forced separations. Yet the practice continued because it fulfilled needs that religious life created, but couldn't satisfy the very structure of monastic existence, with its emphasis on communal living and shared experiences, created conditions where intense relationships were almost inevitable. Women thrown together in isolation, sharing the same struggles and frustrations, naturally sought comfort and understanding from those who could truly comprehend their situation. The fourth shocking practice that scandalized medieval church authorities involved elaborate systems for smuggling contraband items into supposedly secure convents. These weren't simple violations of dietary rules or minor infractions of discipline. These were sophisticated networks that brought everything from secular books and cosmetics to wine, exotic foods, and even weapons into spaces that were meant to be completely cut off from worldly concerns. The evidence comes from confiscated items discovered during surprise inspections, from financial records showing unexplained expenses, and from testimony given by sisters who participated in these smuggling operations. The scale and organization of these networks reveals a level of coordination that challenges everything we thought we knew about medieval convent security and the supposed isolation of religious women. The most extensively documented smuggling operation was discovered at the Abbey of Sainte Claire in northern France during 1456. What investigators found defied every assumption about convent security and revealed networks of corruption that extended far beyond the monastery walls. Hidden beneath the stone floors of storage chambers, concealed within false bottoms of religious artifacts, and sewn into the linings of supposedly sacred vestments were items that had no place in religious life. The contraband included silk fabrics imported from distant lands, precious jewelry that violated every vow of poverty, bottles of wine from regions hundreds of miles away, and books containing secular poetry and romantic literature that directly contradicted religious teachings. Most shocking were the weapons discovered: daggers with jeweled handles, small crossbows, and even poison concealed in religious reliquaries. These weren't items accumulated over months, but collections that represented years of systematic smuggling. The network responsible for this operation included not just the sisters themselves, but a complex web of outside accomplices. Merchants who delivered legitimate supplies to the convent were paid extra to include forbidden items in their shipments. Local craftsmen created specially designed containers with hidden compartments that could pass casual inspection. Even some priests and visiting officials were involved, using their trusted status to carry items that would never be searched when brought by religious authorities. Financial records reveal the economic scale of these operations. Sisters were paying amounts equivalent to several months of a peasant's wages for single items of contraband. They funded these purchases by selling religious artifacts supposedly created for devotional purposes, by accepting bribes for favorable treatment of visiting dignitaries, and in some cases, by charging fees for private religious services that were supposed to be freely given. The psychological motivation behind these smuggling networks reveals the crushing weight of monastic restrictions on women who had never chosen that life. The silk fabrics allowed them to feel beautiful beneath their rough religious habits. The secular books provided escape into worlds of romance and adventure that their daily reality completely denied them. The wine offered temporary relief from the constant pressure of religious perfection. Even the weapons represented a form of psychological security for women who were completely vulnerable within systems they couldn't escape. What made these networks particularly sophisticated was their use of religious festivals and ceremonies as cover for major smuggling operations. During Easter celebrations, Christmas observances, and visits from high church officials, the increased activity and distraction provided perfect opportunities to move large quantities of forbidden items without detection. The sisters developed elaborate codes and signals for coordinating these operations, using religious language and gestures to communicate information about timing, locations, and security risks. The discovery of written records hidden within religious manuscripts reveals the careful planning involved in these operations. Lists of desired items were compiled weeks in advance. Detailed maps showed hiding places throughout the convent grounds. Financial accounts tracked payments and debts with the precision of commercial enterprises. These weren't desperate women grabbing random opportunities, but organized communities creating parallel economies that operated entirely outside official religious structures. Church investigators were particularly disturbed by evidence that some smuggling operations had been active for decades without detection. The networks had developed methods for training new participants, for dealing with security threats, and for managing the risks that came with expanding operations. They had created systems of mutual protection, where discovery of one participant wouldn't necessarily lead to exposure of the entire network. The geographic scope of these smuggling networks extended across international boundaries. Items confiscated from convents in Germany included spices that could only have originated in Spanish territories. French convents contained manuscripts written in languages that no local nun should have been able to read. English religious houses yielded fabrics and jewelry that required trade connections, extending into Eastern Europe and beyond. The fifth and perhaps most shocking practice that flourished in medieval convents involved the systematic falsification of religious experiences and miraculous events. Church authorities discovered that sisters were deliberately creating fake stigmata, manufacturing false visions, and orchestrating elaborate deceptions designed to enhance their reputations for holiness, while providing them with power and privileges unavailable through legitimate religious channels. The evidence for these fabricated miracles comes from medical examinations conducted by church-appointed physicians, from testimony given by sisters who participated in the deceptions, and from physical evidence discovered during investigations. What emerges is a picture of women using their knowledge of religious expectations to create experiences that would elevate their status within both their immediate communities and the broader church hierarchy. The most sophisticated example was discovered at the convent of Santa Maria near Florence in 1489. Sister Magdalena had convinced her entire community and several church officials that she was receiving direct revelations from the Virgin Mary. Her visions included detailed prophecies about political events, specific instructions for religious reforms, and personal messages for prominent church leaders. For over 3 years, her supposed supernatural experiences brought prestige to her convent, attracted wealthy benefactors, and provided her with influence that extended far beyond her monastery walls. The deception began to unravel when investigators noticed inconsistencies in her prophetic messages. Events she claimed had been revealed to her through divine vision had actually been reported in letters from other regions weeks before her supposed revelations. Her detailed knowledge of political situations she should have known nothing about suggested access to information that no cloistered nun should possess. Physical examination revealed that her stigmata had been created using a mixture of pig's blood and plant dyes applied with small brushes. The wounds appeared fresh during her public demonstrations, but showed no signs of supernatural healing or the unusual characteristics that genuine stigmata was supposed to display. Hidden in her cell were the materials she had been using to create these effects, along with detailed notes about timing and presentation techniques. What made this case particularly shocking was the discovery that Sister Magdalena hadn't been working alone. At least 4 other sisters had been helping to maintain the deception, providing alibis during preparation time, creating distractions during crucial moments, and even participating in the creation of physical evidence for her supernatural experiences. They had developed elaborate systems for smuggling information from outside sources, for coordinating their stories during questioning, and for maintaining the illusion even under intensive scrutiny. The motivation behind these fabricated miracles reveals the limited options available to women seeking any form of power or recognition within medieval religious structures. Legitimate paths to authority were virtually non-existent for women, regardless of their intelligence, education, or spiritual dedication. Creating the appearance of special divine favor offered one of the few available routes to influence and respect. Similar cases were discovered across Europe during the 15th and early 16th centuries. In Germany, investigators found that an entire convent had been participating in the creation of false miraculous events, including fabricated healings, manufactured apparitions, and orchestrated supernatural phenomena. In England, several sisters were discovered using hidden mechanisms to create moving religious statues and other apparent miracles that attracted pilgrims and their donations. The technical sophistication of some deceptions was remarkable. Sisters created hidden chambers behind altar walls where they could speak in voices that seemed to come from religious statues. They developed methods for creating unusual lights and sounds during prayer services that appeared to have supernatural origins. They even learned to manipulate their own body temperatures and pulse rates to create medical symptoms that would support claims of divine intervention. Church authorities faced a terrible dilemma when these deceptions were discovered. Exposing the fraudulent nature of supposed miracles risked damaging faith in legitimate religious experiences and undermining confidence in the Church's ability to distinguish between genuine and false supernatural events. Yet, allowing the deceptions to continue would mean building religious authority on foundations of deliberate lies. The punishments for discovered fabrications were among the harshest imposed for any monastic crime. The women involved faced not just physical penalties, but complete erasure of their religious identities. Their names were removed from convent records. Their supposed miracles were officially declared never to have occurred, and they were transferred to the most remote and restrictive religious houses available. Yet the practice continued because it addressed needs that the legitimate religious system couldn't satisfy. Women who possessed intelligence, creativity, and leadership abilities found themselves trapped in institutions that offered no outlet for these qualities. Creating the appearance of supernatural favor provided a way to exercise influence and gain recognition within systems that otherwise offered them no voice or authority. The documentation of these 5 shocking practices reveals a world far removed from the sanitized image of medieval religious life that most people carry today. These weren't isolated incidents or temporary corruptions. but systematic responses to structural problems within monastic institutions. They show us women who refused to disappear completely into the roles assigned to them, who found ways to assert their humanity even within systems designed to erase individual identity. The evidence comes from the Church's own records, preserved not to celebrate these women, but to document the problems they created for religious authorities. Yet, reading between the lines of official condemnations, we can glimpse lives of remarkable creativity, courage, and determination. These women faced impossible choices between spiritual perfection and human nature, between obedience and sanity, between disappearing completely or finding ways to remain visible within institutions that demanded their erasure. As we prepare to examine how these practices ultimately contributed to the transformation of monastic life itself, we must remember that behind every shocking discovery documented in dusty archives was a real woman struggling to survive in circumstances she never chose. Their stories reveal not just the failures of medieval religious institutions, but the irrepressible human drive to find meaning, connection, and dignity, even in the most restrictive circumstances. The systematic documentation of these forbidden practices created an unexpected consequence that church authorities had never anticipated. As reports accumulated in ecclesiastical archives across Europe, patterns began to emerge that revealed the true scope of what was happening behind convent walls. What had been dismissed as isolated incidents of moral weakness was actually evidence of a much deeper crisis within the entire structure of medieval religious life. By the late 15th century, church investigators were discovering that the same shocking practices were appearing simultaneously in convents separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time. The wooden implements found in German convents matched almost exactly those discovered in French monasteries. The smuggling networks operating in England used identical methods to those documented in Italian religious houses. The fabricated miracles created in Spanish convents followed patterns remarkably similar to deceptions uncovered in the Low Countries. This consistency suggested something far more troubling than random moral corruption. It indicated that these practices were natural, almost inevitable responses to the impossible demands placed on women within monastic institutions. When human beings are subjected to identical pressures and restrictions, they develop similar survival strategies regardless of geography or cultural differences. The shocking practices weren't aberrations, but symptoms of systemic failure. The realization struck church authorities with devastating force. They had created institutions supposedly dedicated to spiritual perfection, but those same institutions were consistently producing behaviors they considered among the most spiritually corrupt imaginable. The very structure designed to eliminate human weakness was instead amplifying it, concentrating it, and forcing it to manifest in increasingly desperate and creative ways. Contemporary letters between bishops reveal growing panic about what these discoveries meant for the entire concept of monastic life. If convents across Europe were harboring the same forbidden practices, if women who had dedicated their lives to God were consistently failing to achieve the purity demanded of them, then perhaps the expectations themselves were flawed. This possibility threatened not just individual religious houses, but the theological foundations upon which the entire medieval church had built its authority. The response was swift and comprehensive. New regulations flooded out from ecclesiastical centres, each more restrictive than the last. Surprise inspections became routine rather than exceptional surveillance systems were implemented that made privacy virtually impossible. Physical modifications were made to convent buildings, eliminating hiding places, creating open sightlines, and removing architectural features that had facilitated forbidden activities. Yet these measures only drove the practices deeper underground, while creating new forms of suffering for women who were already struggling under impossible burdens. The increased restrictions didn't eliminate human needs, but simply made addressing them more dangerous and more desperate. Women who had been finding ways to survive within an oppressive system now faced even harsher consequences for their survival strategies. The psychological toll was documented in confessional records that reveal increasing rates of what we would now recognize as severe mental illness. Sisters reported hallucinations, uncontrollable weeping, violent episodes, and complete psychological breakdowns. The combination of impossible expectations, constant surveillance, and harsh punishments for any sign of human weakness created conditions that would challenge the sanity of even the most psychologically robust individuals. Medical records from the period show alarming increases in mysterious illnesses, unexplained deaths, and what physicians delicately term disorders of the feminine constitution. Modern medical analysis suggests these were likely manifestations of severe psychological trauma, malnutrition from extreme fasting, and the physical effects of chronic stress. The bodies of these women were breaking down under pressures that their minds could no longer process or endure. The economic impact of these discoveries rippled far beyond individual convents. Wealthy families who had invested substantial resources in religious houses began questioning whether their money was supporting institutions worthy of respect or harboring centers of corruption. Donations declined precipitously as stories of shocking practices spread through networks of noble families who had previously been reliable sources of funding. Political consequences followed economic ones. Kings and princes who had used convents as convenient depositories for inconvenient female relatives began reconsidering these arrangements. If religious houses couldn't guarantee the moral transformation they promised, then perhaps other solutions needed to be found for managing unwanted daughters, discarded wives, and politically problematic women. The intellectual climate was shifting as well. Humanist scholars began questioning whether institutions that consistently failed to achieve their stated purposes deserved the authority they claimed over human lives. The gap between religious ideals and documented reality became too wide to ignore or rationalize away. Critical examination of monastic life became not just acceptable, but necessary for anyone serious about understanding medieval society. These converging pressures created conditions for the most dramatic transformation of religious life in European history. When Martin Luther posted his criticisms of church corruption in 1517, he found an audience already prepared by decades of accumulating evidence about the failures of monastic institutions. The shocking practices documented in convent archives became weapons in theological battles that would reshape Christianity itself. The dissolution of monasteries that followed Protestant reforms wasn't just about theological disagreements or political power. It was the culmination of centuries of evidence that the monastic system was fundamentally flawed in its understanding of human nature. The women who had developed forbidden practices, who had created secret networks, who had fabricated religious experiences, had unknowingly provided the documentation that would eventually destroy the institutions that had oppressed them. When convent doors finally opened and women were allowed to leave religious life, many discovered that the outside world offered its own challenges. Freedom from monastic restrictions didn't automatically translate into genuine freedom or security. Society had limited options for women without family connections, financial resources, or marketable skills. Some found the uncertainty of secular life more frightening than the predictable oppression they had known behind religious walls. Yet for those who chose to leave, even the harshest secular circumstances often felt preferable to the psychological torture of trying to live as angels while remaining fundamentally human. The testimony of former nuns describes the profound relief of being able to acknowledge natural emotions, form genuine relationships, and make choices about their own lives without constant fear of spiritual punishment. These 5 shocking practices reveal a truth that medieval authorities desperately tried to conceal. No institution, regardless of how sacred it claims to be, can completely suppress human nature. The women behind convent walls weren't monsters or saints, but ordinary people trapped between impossible expectations and natural desires. Their stories remind us that when systems demand perfection while ignoring humanity, rebellion becomes not just inevitable, but necessary for survival.